Chants of Sennaar is a language-based puzzle game set on a brightly coloured Tower of Babel, with dramatic architecture, views over unearthly vistas, and 5 separate cultures that need to be understood in order to progress. But it builds that world using the familiar. Almost immediately in the first area, I hear a familiar rattle. It's the alarm call of a Eurasian magpie. I can instantly approximate the location of the developers, and a quick Google confirms they're French. This game is situated somewhere close to me, even though the space that I'm moving through is utterly alien. And that's about as far as I can get without spoiling Chants of Sennaar, which is kind of built around figuring things out for yourself, so, you've been warned, take that into account as you will. The tower itself doesn't need to be familiar, but the game relies on you being able to intuit certain ideas about its languages, even if you're not an expert on linguistics. Thankfully, because communication is so hardwired into the human brain, you know certain things even if you don't know that you know. For example, there's a concept you might have heard of because it's become something of a meme called the Bouba Kiki effect. In experiments in the 1920s, scientists found that people tended to associate certain sounds with certain shapes. Bouba is rounded. Kiki is sharp. These findings have held across many, although potentially not all, different native language groups. The language in the second area of Chants of Sennaar is most certainly Kiki. Where the first language uses glyphs with both straight lines and curves, the second language is entirely angular. This second language is the language of the warriors. Where the first was a religious language with words for devotee, abbey, and church, the second is martial, fortress, weapon. The devotees are the only group with a word for God, but the warrior's glyph for duty is very similar, creating an instant shortcut to understanding what's important to each of them. And the warrior's Kiki-ish script gives you a sense of the difference between the two cultures even before you've translated many words. But language isn't just vocabulary. It's also necessary to understand the different grammar patterns of the languages in each area. In the first, for example, plurals are made by repeating the glyph, while the second has a plural marker that comes before the word it's modifying. In this early caption, you can see that the glyph for warrior is repeated, but once you have all the words confirmed, it becomes warriors. And in the second area, they show you directly that this isn't how it's always going to work. Instead, you get this shield with 2 direct translations, the first one being warriors don't like death. You can see in the first script the double warrior glyph, but in the second there's still 5 glyphs, so you can figure out that one of them is a plural marker. And unlike the S we might add to the end of a word in English, it comes before the noun. This is your first hint that things aren't always going to be structured exactly how you might expect. Both of these first areas use subject-verb-object sentence structure like English. Warriors closing the door, or bellman awaits the bottle. By the way, a quick aside here because this is a YouTube video and as a writer I'm not used to being able to get away with it. The bellman is maybe my favourite part of this game. He's the only person in the warriors area who doesn't seem to be a warrior. And he's ostracized and maybe has a drinking problem, but if you deliver his bottle to him, he sits up on top of his house and watches the stars. And it's genuinely this really peaceful, beautiful moment that sits apart from the rest of the game. I hope he's doing good. It also gives me an in to talk about 2 other places where you can see fascinating real-world influences in this game that aren't puzzle related. Firstly, you know how lamps in video games use real electricity? The stars in this game are affected by real-world light pollution. It's really striking to me that the sky is so faded here, even though there's an observatory that ends up being pretty important. I feel like if the developers were used to a darker night sky, this place would have been absolutely glittering, but instead we get this mid-city look, even though as far as we can tell the tower is completely isolated. Secondly, it's interesting that the bellman is the bell man, right? It's one of the only places in the entire game where we get an indication of gender, except that certain words also still carry this real-world patriarchy that feels out of place in the game. One of the first words you learn is person, except it's rendered as man/person for no reason that I can see. Are all of the people on the first floor men? That would be a fascinating thing to explore, but the game doesn't actually go there. And later you get the word brotherhood and it ends up being kind of crucial, we'll get to that later. But again, there's no indication of masculinity in this world other than the casual use of language like this. Lamps in video games use real electricity, languages in video games use real patriarchal conventions. Anyway, back to word order. The third language is the first one that doesn't use subject-verb-object, becoming more unfamiliar to an English or French-speaking audience. The script it's written in is reminiscent of Devanagari, which is used to write dozens of languages, many of which don't use the subject-verb-object order. The Sennaar language actually uses object-subject-verb, which isn't the default in any written language, although it is common in British Sign Language, for example. But the appearance of this sort of script primes the player to expect a shift in word order from what they're expecting, both from their real-life language and from the languages they've been working in so far. The people who speak the fourth language call themselves alchemists. The first and third languages have no known word for them. The former are separated by the warriors who block off access to the higher floors of the tower, and the latter by a monster that makes traversing the gap dangerous. But the warriors themselves call them scientists. When colonists encountered native groups, they often ended up naming them based on exonyms, that is, what nearby groups called them. These names were often derogatory, and they often stuck. Apache means enemy. Cherokee may be a Muskogee term for people who speak a different language, and Shu is a shortening of little snakes. In Chants of Sennaar, the names that different groups use for one another are often horizontal approximations, like the alchemist-scientist divide, but both the devotees and the warriors call the people on the third floor the chosen ones. There's a reverence that extends to their cultures. The warriors believe that it's their duty to protect the chosen, while the devotees are kept from visiting them because they're seen as impure. The people on the third floor call themselves bards. They seem much less concerned with the societal structure built up on floors 1 and 2, instead having their own stratification. At first, the bards seem content to while away their days in their garden home with art and culture, their language having words for agora, theatre, and windmill. But after a while, it becomes clear that there's an underclass of blue-masked bards, referred to exclusively with the word for idiot. So the linguistic and cultural divisions of the tower are obvious and key, but scattered two to a floor are computer terminals. Some of these terminals show two of the groups trying to talk to one another. Once you've been to the top and learned the truth of the world, that the tower is held deliberately apart by a program called Exile, you can descend down again and provide translations for these conversations. Not only are you facilitating speaking to one another, but each group is asking for help that only another group can provide. Most European languages, including English and several Asian ones, are descendants of a single root language called Proto-Indo-European. This language was spoken maybe 6,000 or so years ago, most likely in the region of the Black Sea. By comparing the vocabularies of languages as far apart as Hindi and Irish, it's been possible to reconstitute a large portion of Proto-Indo-European and therefore find out what kind of words they had. For example, since words like Veda, Padre, Pater, Pitar, and father all follow established patterns of linguistic shift in their respective languages, it's possible to say that they must have had a common root. In the case of English and Dutch, that root is Old German, but to account for the Romance languages and ancient languages like Latin and Sanskrit, the root must go back further. Thousands of these examples of reconstruction make up what we know about Proto-Indo-European. It might not be surprising that they had a word for father given how human reproduction works, but what about
Deus Bechter?
Reconstructed Proto-Indo-European has a lot of hedges on both accuracy and pronunciation, evidenced by the various diacritics in how it's written, but you can already see where these roots have found themselves in modern English as well as other languages. Deity, from the still familiar Latin deus, is a clear connection. So too is Zeus Pater, as in the father of the Greek gods. We can see, based on language reconstruction as well as cultural continuation, that the group of people who spoke Proto-Indo-European worshipped a sky god. In the same way, we can build a pretty convincing picture of their entire culture, despite it leaving no written record. We know they had archery, poets, livestock, and a reciprocal gift-based economy. They span, weaved, made beer, and kept dogs. The groups in Chants of Sennaar are separated. The true ending of the game requires fixing this by translating the requests on the computer terminals. To do that, you have to find the concepts that the groups share among all their differences. The alchemists and the devotees both have a word for plant, and the devotees need help restoring their dying garden. The warriors learn that the devotees can't be impure because they both love music, and they invite both the devotees and the bards to perform in the fortress. The alchemists ask for help with the monster, saying they're afraid to do it themselves. The warriors respond that they have no fear, although, notably, they have a word for it. The devotees offer freedom at the abbey to the underclass of the bards, and the alchemists offer them, well, brotherhood, which perhaps undermines the connectedness they're apparently offering. I didn't talk about all those real-world cultural implications for nothing. But this unfitting hitch aside, the stitching together of Chants of Sennaar's Tower of Babel requires, to varying degrees of abstraction, care, art, bravery, freedom, and allyship. Its world is pieced together from bits of ours that make our understanding of it slot together piece by piece. And if we're looking for a foundation to build on, we could do worse than the one it suggests.